I think business model innovation at its core essentially sort of taps in a relatively low risk way of making yourself relevant in the future. So what do I mean by that? See, if you go in for innovation on technology, trying to change the product, you have to really invest a lot in trying to figure out what would be the next best product that you can offer to the market, which would be probably driven by technology. So these kind of R&D investments, so to speak, are huge, and very few companies have the pockets to be able to do that. And the risks of getting it right are extremely high, right? It's not so easy to get it done. On the flip side, the business model part is an easy, low-hanging fruit where you can innovate by trial and test and sort of try new things, try to change your models here and there, tinker with them, and sort of figure out what works, what doesn't. So the way I look at things, I look at business model innovation as a relatively low-risk way of innovating slowly, taking small steps, and making sure that you remain relevant in the changing world, right? So that's why I think it's very important. Right. So this whole movement of process-based innovation, to me, is, I mean, you can call it business model innovation or process-based innovation, but essentially, if I being a bit more simplistic, if you think about innovation, you can say, well, I can innovate on the what, right, which I earlier said is the product, or I can innovate on the how, which is how do I sell what I sell, whether it's a product or a service. So processes are essentially which determine how do you take from all the way from a raw material to a finished product which ultimately you sell to paying consumers. And innovating at that level is what I think creates a process-based business model innovation. Now, to give you an example, I mean, in fact, the way I look at it, most of the innovations in this world that we see are process innovations. So let's go to our most often talked about, which is Uber or Grab, right? What are they? I mean, at the end of the day, they're selling transportation. It's not a new product. Transportation has always been sold for ages, right? But what they did was they changed how we sell this transportation product, how we do the matching between supply and demand. And that is a typical example of a process-based innovation. Of course, technology had a role to play here, but that wasn't their technology. I mean, the core technology was a smartphone, a internet-connected smartphone, which then they added some kind of components to it to make their business model viable. But essentially, it was a process of matching supply and demand, which is where their innovation came in. Which also wasn't really their innovation. If you think about it, it wasn't done to transportation. It existed in many other sectors, right? So in some sense, it's sort of a, as I said, a low-hanging fruit and a relatively less risk fruit. So if I think about, so when it comes to technology disruption, I mean, the reason I put an economic lens on these things is because a lot of times I feel that people are chasing technology for the sake of it, right? I mean, why are we running after technology? What are we doing? Are we getting some cost benefits from it? Are we reducing our risk in the system? Is this going to lead to some sort of growth and new market opportunities? Is this going to, where is, ultimately I want to see the business from the eyes of, what is the value that it creates and what role does technology add to that value creation process? So cost, growth, risk, these are the three dimensions that I focus on to try and understand why technology and what is the purpose of this technology. Hard to say. It's possible. The successes were driven by a multitude of factors, including their timing, which you have to say is very hard to predict, but they were definitely entering the market at a point in time when people were very comfortable with the concept of giving your apartment out to strangers, or getting into a car which is being driven by a complete stranger to you, as opposed to a taxi driver who you would imagine would at least go to some regulatory check or has some employment contract with an agency, which sort of increases trust. So you could say, yes, the timing was good, that people were comfortable with this. Is this a sustainable business model or not? It's an interesting question, and the answer, it's hard for me to really pinpoint whether this can sustain or not. So what are the challenges to these business models? Many. You mentioned regulation. I think it's even beyond regulation, right? I mean, ultimately, companies like Uber and Airbnb are intermediaries. But if tomorrow the technology of blockchains, for example, becomes commercially viable and as sophisticated as we want it to be, then would we need these intermediaries? Can we just transact over a technology like blockchain and interact with each other, where I provide you an apartment should you need one if you come to Singapore, and somebody else provides me with a car service should I need one, without having the intermediary? So it's not clear to me. There are lots of threats to these business models. I mean, don't get me wrong, these companies are also very nimble and they adapt to changing environments very quickly. But I think it's hard to forecast whether they'll survive. But there are lots of factors that will play a role together to ultimately determine their success. Not to mention that Uber is going through all sorts of other issues which have nothing to do with their business model. So there's a whole plethora of reasons why they may not be as successful as they are today.